When I need to change the blade on my table saw, this is what I need to do. This is how my blades are stored, and it's a terrible solution because the teeth are touching metal on metal contact, and that is not good for your blades, or a good place to store them or look through them. So today, I'm going to solve that problem. I see a lot of guys have the 4x8 sheets of insulation they laid on the floor to cut up product like this sheet goods. I don't have one of those, so I'm laying down some scrap 2x6s and 2x3s so that I'm ready to make this cut without cutting into my floor or anything else. I'm basically just breaking down a half of a sheet of 1/4-inch ply. The plywood I'm using is called Luan ply, and it's the cheapest plywood that my local lumberyard has available, and since this is a shop project, it's the perfect stuff to use. It was much cheaper than Baltic birch, so it'll do just fine, but you'll see toward the end of the video I get quite a bit of tear out on it, so I'm not particularly happy with that. It could be the blade I'm using as well. I was using a combination blade instead of something more designed for plywood. Typically I don't have that issue with normal 3/4 or 1/4-inch Baltic birch ply, but I did have it with this. After marking 2 lines at the 48-inch mark, I get a straight edge and draw a straight line so that I have a reference line to use. Now, I prefer to do my final cuts on the table saw because I feel like I get a more accurate cut since I don't have a track saw. So this is just going to rough cut so that it's more manageable on the table saw. I've broken down a full sheet of 1/4-inch ply on the table saw before, and while it's probably safe enough, I feel like it's safer just to cut the sheet in half if I'm going to be able to get the dimensions I need out of it. Once my line's drawn, I go over to the edge of the plywood and set my blade depth so it's not going too deep and hit the garage floor, but it's going deep enough that I can cut this in half in one pass, and then I'm ready to make my cut. Now it's over to the table saw to make sure my combination blade that I mentioned is installed. That's what I always use to rip down plywood. Once I get that on, get it adjusted to the right height, I'll be ready to cut the plywood. It's a good time to mention that all the tools, including that blade that I'm using in this project, I'll have listed below with links, so if you want to go check those out, if there's anything you need that you find that you could use in your shop, you'll be able to find those at links below. I cut my first piece just a little bit wide because I wanted to take the very edge of the full sheet of plywood off before I use that as my final cut. So I'm going to take that edge off. With thin plywood and even thicker plywood, you know, the edge isn't perfect once you actually get it into the shop. So it had been dinged around a little bit, so I wanted to take that off so I have nice, even, clean cuts on all the pieces that I'll be making out of this. I'm ripping this half sheet into 11 3/4-inch wide strips because I'll be storing 10-inch blades inside them, so that gave me enough of an overhang that I was able to glue up the exterior, or that protects the blades around them, as you'll see, but also not too close to 12 inches because, you know, using 4 feet of sheet with taking in the consideration the kerf of the blade, I don't want to lose too much material and have one set of these that weren't quite as wide as the rest, so I played it safe with 11 3/4-inch. Now it was time to cut these long sections into squares, so I wanted my fence to be at the same position it was while I was ripping it. Now, this isn't technically a cross cut because I'm not really cutting across the grain with plywood. You don't want to run boards across the table saw this direction if they are wider to you than they are long. However, because this is 1/4-inch ply, and I did that little test pushing it back and forth to see how it reacted to me pushing it, I keep my tabletop nice and waxed and I keep my blade sharp, so I was confident in my ability to control this cut, and I had a good reference edge on the right side up against the fence. So while I would not recommend doing this, I was perfectly comfortable with this level of safety that I had here. While keeping my fence at that same 11 3/4-inch setting, I grabbed a piece of 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood that I was going to use for a template for cutting out the circles that the blades would sit down in. So I cut a square out of that material, and you'll see how I implement that as a guide for routing out the holes that the blades will sit in later on. With all my pieces cut, I needed to find the center of the 1/2-inch piece of ply that I was going to be using as my template. So I used a straight edge, drew a line across from corner to corner, Realized I completely missed one of the corners because this isn't particularly flat on this surface I'm using, so I tried again. So this is a shop project, so a lot of shop projects for me, I'm sorry to say, I just get close enough because I'm the only one that's ever going to see it. I guess unless you put it on YouTube. Having found the center, or at least close enough to it, I use a small screw to put into that center point. That'll allow me to be able to use a string and measure out a perfect circle from where I need it to be in order to hold a blade. So I cut a piece of that string that's going to be long enough, and then I tie one end of it around that screw. After that, I use a ruler, and from that center point I mark out 5 1/8 of an inch so that there's enough room for a 10-inch blade with a little bit of wiggle room around the outside, because I don't want those teeth too snug up against the part that are holding them in place. With that, I'm able to find that mark with my pencil. First I try to wrap the string around, which is kind of a silly idea. It's not going to hold it quite where I want it to. So instead, I decided I was going to pivot the board around the pencil point, because I was able to control the point of the pencil better that way. Confirming a blade does in fact fit within the circle that I drew, I'm able to take the screw out, get the appropriate size drill bit just to start off a hole there. I did not have my drill in the correct setting, which is why it kind of stalled out and caught there. But after I got it dialed in, I was able to get a hole all the way through, and all I need that for is a place to be able to get my jigsaw blade down through so I can cut out that circle. Cutting out an interior circle with a jigsaw on a piece this small required me to move the piece quite a bit, rotating it around, moving clamps. I had it clamped down to the edge of this piece of plywood that I use for a outfeed table for now. I'll be building an outfeed table here not too distant in the future. But for now I just clamped it to the edge. I had to rotate this a lot, and you'll see later on when I'm routing out that edge, I had to rotate that quite a bit as well. And just moving clamps, rotating everything around, and getting it to where I can make the cuts I need to cut. Now that my rough circle was cut out, getting as close to the line as I could without going through the line, I went over to my spindle sander so that I could clean up that edge and get right up to that line. This is a good way to sneak up on a line like that, especially on an interior edge that's rounded. So I was able to use that and get right up to where I needed to be to get to the right size for the blade. After confirming the blade fit in the final hole that I made for my template, I was able to use that template to make circles on 2 of the panels that I'd cut out earlier. I cut out a total of 16 of these so that I can do 8 stacks, as you'll see. So I made the line using the template on 2 of them, because in order to cut them I was going to do 2 stacks of 4 each. Now if that math isn't adding up to you, there's 16 pieces total. I'll have 8 pieces with the circle cut out that the blade's going to sit into, and 8 pieces that will be backers to keep the blade separated, as you'll see here shortly. With a set of 4 of these clamped together, I'm able to drill a hole for a pilot hole to get my jigsaw in again and start cutting out that circle. Again, getting as close to that line as possible without going through it. A little bit rough jigsaw work. Again, I'm getting a ton of tear out. I probably need to replace the blade on my jigsaw, but it's a shop project. Like I said, I'll sand it down and it's going to be completely functional, even if it's not the most beautiful thing in the world. Now this is where the template comes back into play. I'm going to clamp that to one end of a stack of the 4 of the work pieces. Make sure it's nice and tight and squared up as best I can just by hand, because I'm not worried about it being too perfect. And then I'm going to use a flush trim router bit with a either bottom bearing or top bearing. I always get them confused. Let me know what the difference is if you remember. And again, I'm just shuffling these clamps around so I can get to where I need to go. But I'm flush trimming to that sanded down half-inch piece that I'm using for the template to get to where the final circumference is going to be, and make sure that they're all exactly the same. Alright, now with all my pieces cut, I'm ready to sand down the surfaces. Again, I'm not trying to make these too perfect, so I'm just going to use 150 grit. I'm going to start with that and end with that. My main purpose for this is just to tear out, sand off any of that tear out that came from the router or the table saw. So I want to make them smooth enough that they're going to slide across each other, as you'll see in a few minutes. And at this point, I'd like to ask you, if you found any of this useful at all, please consider subscribing and liking this video. If you thought it was a terrible idea and you'd never do this in your shop, please send it to someone you can't stand and ask them to subscribe so that they can suffer through this kind of thing. Now, before I get each individual blade holder assembled, I want to make sure that I have a way of getting the blades back out very easily, because that's kind of the point. If I can't store it in a way that I can get to my blades quickly when I need them, it defeats the purpose. So I have a 5/8 inch arbor on my table saw, which is the standard size. So starting with the 5/8, make sure that fits perfectly in the hole. Of course it does. I went up to 7/8, went past 3/4, went up to 7/8 to make sure that I can stick my finger through the hole of the saw blade and have a little bit of surface area to grab that wasn't blocked by the actual blade storage itself. Once my center hole's drilled, it's time to go back to my favorite activity, and I'm sure a lot of you will agree, sanding these down, getting all the chip out off and making sure they're nice and smooth to ride across each other. With everything sanded, I can now lay out all my pieces, and you can kind of start to get an idea of how this is going to look when I'm done if you don't already have an idea in your mind. Once they're all laid out, I'm going to grab some Titebond Original because I don't need a ton of holding strength here. I'm just attaching two pieces of plywood together essentially. So I go with Titebond Original. I'm just applying it on the back side of the boards with the larger circle cut out of them. I'm not even going to wipe this stuff around because I know it's going to squeeze and have a pretty good grip, so I'm not worried about having that perfect even squeeze out all the way around. It's going to be plenty strong enough as it is, so no point in taking too much time to make sure it's evenly spread. And after you see me do a couple, you get the idea, so we'll just go ahead and skip the rest of those. I waited for just under 30 minutes to have it in clamps. That way the glue that might have squeezed out a little bit was still a little bit tacky, and I could wipe it off if I needed to. There's a little bit of squeeze out into the blue and the actual blade groove, so I wanted to get that out of there so it wasn't in the way of the blade laying perfectly flat. After getting all 8 sections glued together, I marked a spot 1 inch in from each edge on one of the corners and then drilled a hole all the way through. This is where the pivot point's going to be. So after I get that hole drilled, I'm able to put a carriage bolt through and then add a washer and nut to the other side, and that's going to be basically like a hinge for this to rotate around. Now back over to the table saw very briefly with the rest of that 1/2 inch ply that I had used for the template. I'm cutting a 3 inch wide strip that I'm going to use for some feet. Now, unlike the 1/4 inch, this was too narrow for me to use without a sled, so I used my sled, set up the width using the piece itself, and a stopper so that they're all even, though really they don't need to be. I wanted to make it a little bit uniform, and I was able to cut 4 feet with my crosscut sled that will go on the bottom so that that bolt isn't sticking out and holding everything up at a weird angle. And then it's back over to use some Titebond 1 to attach those to the bottom. Again, not measuring these out, they don't need to be perfect. At this point I could lay out all the blades that I had, get them out of that stack and really take an inventory so I knew what I was working with, and then one by one lay them into the new storage system. And there's a few ways I could have labeled this, but I kept it simple. What style blade it is and how many teeth. And then for the ones that still had labeling on them, I put the brand that was on the blade so that I knew which was which. And I went down the list and did this for each of the blades that I had. Having assembled everything and proved the concept to myself, like I didn't know it was going to work, I then took everything back apart and used some Johnson's paste wax on all the surfaces of these just to make sure they slid across each other nice and smooth when they were stacked up, and kind of protect them from the blade a little bit too. After about 15 minutes, I took a rag and wiped off all the excess wax that was on the surface, and then once that was done and they were nice and cleaned off, I flipped them over and did the backside as well. With all the surfaces waxed and ready to go, I was able to put the carriage bolt back in, reattaching all the different sections into one solid piece to hold all of my table saw blades. And now for a quick demonstration of the final build. I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. I wouldn't say this is maybe the best storage solution. I like how it works for me. There's a lot of options out there, and I don't think there's a right way of doing things. I'm by no means the end-all authority on this stuff, but if you like this idea, feel free to copy it and build your own. Please consider liking and subscribing the video. You can also find me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok.